What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going over another episode of enemies on the first person shooter tutorial. So I've replaced the cubes, the chamfers, with some war zombies, and these war zombies I got right off Mixamo. So I'll go over importing them and things like that when we get there. But what we can do now is we can actually have a skeletal mesh, play an animation, still under the health bar, and when we injure him, we can have him play an animation, such as like a take damage animation. And then eventually, once he loses enough health here, we can actually get him to play a death animation, and he won't get back up. Now he is dead. This doesn't change his collision box or anything yet. We'll have to disable it and things like that. There's a few things we'll have to do after his death that I'm not going to cover in today's episode, because the enemies sub-series of the first-person shooter tutorial is going to be probably the longest. I'm expecting it to be at least 10 episodes with what I want to plan on doing. And you're probably asking why I'm doing enemies now as opposed to some other simpler concepts. But honestly, enemies are probably one of the most important things in a first-person shooter game, if not the most important, other than just making the game feel right, which Unreal does a lot of that for you. So I figured let's get into some of the enemies, even if it's just basic for now and we have to cut and come back to it, just to have something that we can do to kind of progress our game. So soon after we clean up them after dying and things like that, we're going to have them start walking toward us and attacking us. Also, just wanted to show off this sweet trick shot that you can pull off, because there's ricochet in this game. I just thought that was the coolest thing, and figured I'd show it with you guys. So, okay. What we're going to do today is replace the cube, the chamfer that the enemy was, where it was just basically an inanimate object, replace it with a skeletal mesh, and apply animations to the mesh. There'll be a few things we have to change to make that happen. We're also going to kind of just play around with his positioning, and I'll show you kind of what's a good place to position him based on his collision sets and his animations and things like that. We're also going to set up some initial logic so we can kind of plan on what happens when he takes damage, what happens when he dies, things like that. So let's get started. Let's start with changing the mesh. It won't take very long, but I think it's the most important part, the most exciting part, let me say. Okay, so we don't have to do anything in default enemy BP, but I do want to bring attention that we're going to change this mesh here. So we might not have to change anything in the graph, but there's still something we want to do. We want to come over here where it says add component and go ahead and add skeletal mesh, this guy right here. Now when you add one, it'll add a few things like this capsule component, arrow component, mesh, and skeletal mesh. Before, we just had a static mesh and our health bar. Make sure you delete your static mesh, which is that little cube thingy. And now in your skeletal mesh, you'll be able to select different things. Now, if you don't have a skeleton in your game or your animation blueprint, that's fine. We'll go ahead and add one. I already have a video showing how to import animations from Mixamo, so I'm not going to go over that today because that on its own would be a video length. So if you want to check out how to import animations, go ahead and click on the iCard in the top right corner right now. If you have animations or you know how to import animations, you're all good. I'm going to show you what mine are anyway. So my mesh, I downloaded this. I kept the name the same to give credit to the author. So War Zombie F Pedroso, which I think is Pedro. So hopefully I'm giving this person the credit they deserve. Mixamo is all free for commercial use or for just general use. So as long as you're not trying to sell it as a different asset or something like that, you're allowed to put it in your game and use it. That's why I love that site. But I still wanted to give credit because it was still awesome. It's a great model that they worked on, and I figured they deserve some credit for that. But I just imported it. I didn't change anything with the skeleton. So War Zombie F Pedroso is how we're going to pronounce it, even though it might be Pedroso. Okay, and I've also added some animations from Mixamo. So I'll just show you what they are real quick. Death animation. Hit reaction, which is when he gets shot or punched or whatever. Idle. Standing there just kind of going back and forth. And walking. Which we're not going to put in walking today. That's for next episode, but you can just see that I have the animation. Okay, so once you have that imported, once you have your animations and your mesh imported, and when you import your character from Mixamo, it will come with a skeleton, like I said, and I just got out of it, but let me show you. Right here, the Skeletal Mesh, you can see it's got the name Warzombie F, and then Skeletal Mesh in parentheses. This is what you're looking for. So this thing will show up in the default enemy BP if you click on Skeletal Mesh and go over to the details panel and look at Mesh, Skeletal Mesh, you can find the skeleton now. It is right here. So if you go ahead and select that, your guy will pop up, which is great, but he won't be animated, he'll be static. If we want to apply animations to him, we need to set his animation blueprint. However, that's also something we haven't made yet. So we can go ahead and make that. Before we get into doing that, we do want to change our class over for our default enemy BP. If you look at my class settings, my parent class is default enemy, which is good. That's what we want. We want the parent class of this blueprint to be the code class of the enemy. That's all good, all set up. If you haven't been following along with this series, I'll post an iCard right here that's got the first episode of the first-person shooter tutorial series. You might want to catch up because we're going to be getting into some coding, but it's going to be very light in today's episode, so don't worry. Just if you want to catch up to what we were doing and how we made the default enemy class and things like that, then you might want to do that here. Okay. What I'd recommend doing is this. We're using the default enemy BP with the static mesh of a cube as an actor. So we intentionally inherited off of actor in the code class when we created it. We're going to change that now because now we don't need him to be just an actor. We need him to be a character. He needs to be able to have character logic, and he also needs to be able to be found in the animation blueprint when we're looking for the pawn owner, which actors cannot. They have to be characters. So if we go into our code class and you go to your header file of your default enemy, so default enemy.h, go to where it says class, the name of your project _API, and then the name of your class, so a default enemy. Public, this will be a actor if you were following the tutorial exactly. Change this to a character. Now, also, up in your includes, it will say game framework /actor.h. Make sure you switch it to game framework /character.h. If you don't do either of those things, you won't be able to find it in your AnimBP. Make sure you switch those both over. The rest should stay the same. Actor and character both override begin play and tick. So neither of these are going to get screwed up or anything because we're switching it. So you shouldn't get any errors with that. When you go into your default enemy CPP file, you shouldn't have to change anything in here either. That's the beauty of it. And you won't have to change anything in your default enemy BP because our parent class is default enemy. So it doesn't care if it's an actor, character, whatever. It just cares about this code class, which we just changed. Excellent. While we're in the code, let's go ahead and add a few variables. So in your header file of your enemy, which is now a character, I'm going to have two booleans, has taken damage and is dead. So the comments describe it and they're pretty self-explanatory, but has the enemy been hit and is the enemy dead? Pretty simple. I made these both view property, blueprint read write, because I'm going to check these booleans to use them in the anim state machine so that we can switch between the enemy's animations from idle to take damage, or from idle to dead, or from take damage to dead. So if you go ahead and make those two, they're both booleans. And then you go into the code class. Make sure you set them to your defaults in the constructor, the same place we were setting our health to 1 to full. Set them both to false because when the actor spawns, they've not taken damage and they're not dead. Then go down to where we wrote our take damage function. It was literally just health minus equals damage. That was our function. we're going to add a little bit of logic here. The way I'm doing it here isn't necessary. There's two ways you could do it. One way would be a little bit quicker, but I prefer this method just because I don't want the enemy to play the take damage animation and go into the is dead animation on the last hit. I'd prefer if the last hit is a hit to kill the enemy, you go straight to is dead and not to has taken damage. It just looks a little bit smoother. However, if you do end up making him take damage and then shooting him again, he will go to is dead anyway, so it works on two different accounts there. But what we're doing is we're checking if the health is less than or equal to 0.0f, which is literally just 0. So if our health is less than or equal to 0, then we're dead. Otherwise, we're taking damage. Right at this point, if the take damage function is called, we know we're being hit, so we can assume that we're taking damage. But I only want to set their taking damage state to true if they're not going to be dead immediately after that damage. Okay, I'll show you an example of that when we play the game again, so don't worry if that's a little confusing. Okay, now that we make sure you build, I should mention this, it's been a bit, make sure you build solution, wait for it to complete, say like one completed, and then go over and hit compile. Once you're done with that, we still need to set our anim BP in the skeletal mesh, which we don't have yet. So let's go ahead and make an anim blueprint. So I've made an animation blueprints folder within my blueprints folder, and I've called it default animation or default enemy anim BP. To do this, you hit add new animation blueprint. It'll tell you what class you want to choose. I always leave it alone, don't touch this, which means it'll go off of anim instance by default. You can also select it if you want, but anim instance is fine for everything we're doing, so go ahead and just leave it like that if you'd like. If you do have another one that you'd rather use, feel free, but since these are using different skeletons, I'd recommend just leaving it at anim instance. Then you choose your skeleton, so make sure you choose the skeleton of your enemy, which for me is the War Zombie F Pedro. I'm not going to hit OK because it'll make a new one, but once you hit OK, it'll go ahead and make this for you. Go into that, and we're not doing a ton of logic here, so it shouldn't be too hard. You can see this is all I've got, but we're going to set up a state machine. So we actually have not done this in the first-person shooter tutorial series yet, which in the other series we have, so I'll go over it in a lot of depth since this is the first time we're actually looking at it. I know we went over some stuff for the first-person character, but that was all for the first-person view, and it didn't account for a lot of things. So let's just start from scratch. When you first open this, you'll probably look at a screen like this. This output pose won't have anything going into it, or it might have, I can't remember. So you're definitely going to have this output pose. You might have this node, but it'll just say like new graph or whatever. You can usually rename it. You don't have to. I rename it to default state machine just so you guys understand what's going on. If you don't have anything here, right click and hit new state machine. It'll be add new state machine. You'll get this, and then you can just rename this. Right click and rename. I'm going to delete him out of here. I don't think he stays. Yep, we're good. Okay, so once you make that, go ahead and drag this into that. That's simple. And you can double click on here to open up your default state machine. Okay, so here you'll just have the entry node. We're going to make 4 nodes today. Again, we're only going to be using 3. I'm not going to have walking in today, but we can go ahead and set it up, and then I'll cover it again when we go over walking specifically. So in your anim state machine, a state machine is basically, you have these 4, well, you have as many states as you want, and these are the animations that your character can go to. So the war zombie right now can go from idle to take damage, idle to dead, or idle to walking. You can see walking can go to idle. That's what these arrows are. Walking to idle, idle to walking, walking to dead, idle to dead, walking to take damage, idle to take damage, and take damage back to idle. I know this box is kind of in the way, but you can see this is idle to take damage. This orange line is take damage to idle. Okay. So you can add as many states as you want by right-clicking and hit Add State. You don't have to type anything. Just right-click, Add State. I made 4. Like I said, make as many as you like. It's not too important. It'll depend on everyone's game and what they're doing. For now, this should give you enough of a start. So make them, rename them to what you want. Idle, take damage, dead, walking. Now, you can go ahead and connect them now. You just drag, literally click on one node, on the edge of one node, and drag it to the other. Just like this. You'll know you've done it right if it says create a transition when you're hovered over it. Okay, so in our take damage and in our walking and all these states, we have these transition rules. These transition rules are what it requires to go from one state to another. So the idle to take damage, for example, if I hover over this, and sometimes it doesn't want to work, it looks like it's not going to work this time. There we go. Idle to take damage, our transition rule is has taken damage. So has taken damage is our boolean in the code that we made that gets set if the take damage function gets called, but the enemy is not yet dead. So we want to play the take damage animation. So to do this, we need to set up our transition rule to get our has taken damage variable. Also, we need to make sure we have a state to go to, which you already set it up with the arrows, but just so you know, this is how you add animations to states. Double click on the inside of one of these nodes, so like idle, and then you can go ahead and look at your asset browser down here in the bottom right. If it's not here for whatever reason, go to go to Window, here it is, and then go to, I believe, I could find an asset browser right here. And this will bring it up. Sometimes it's not there by default. I've had a few people mention that it wasn't there by default for them, even when it was the first time they were opening the editor. So, interesting. But that's how you can add this here. This will show you all the animations that are compatible with your current skeleton for your animation blueprint. So, for idle, I want to drag over War Zombie Idle. And it's pretty self-explanatory, but War Zombie Walking should be in Walking, War Zombie Death should be in Dead, and War Zombie Hit Reaction should be in Take Damage. You can literally just drag them onto the screen. Okay. So now we have our state machine. We have transitions between them. We don't have the transition rules, and we have our animations in the states. Last thing we need to do is set up the transition rules. However, we need to do one thing before we do that. So let's go into our event graph, and let's set up something called a character reference. We're setting this up because we don't want to make a different animation boolean here, and we can't directly access this has taken damage function without some sort of reference to our character class. There's different ways to do it. I think this is the most convenient way. So just follow along for a second and it'll kind of make more sense as we do it. So ignore this for now. We'll get into that. We just need to worry about this part right here. So in your animation BP, in the event graph, which you will have an event graph, you might have to find it because it might not be up in your tabs right away. So just click on graphs down here, event graph. You can double click right there. It should open it. All right, you'll have some nodes to begin with, like begin play, blueprint update animation. Right now we just want blueprint update animation. You'll also have this try get pawn owner directly under it, but if for whatever reason you don't, you can search for this. Try get pawn owner. Try get pawn owner is the owner of this pawn. So since we're in an anim instance, because this is what the animation blueprint is, we want to go ahead and try and cast the owner of this to whatever's using the anim BP. Well, we know the anim BP is being used by our default enemy BP because we're going to set our anim class here. And feel free to do this now. If you go back to your default enemy BP, click on your Skeletal Mesh, under Details, Animation, Animation Mode, use Animation Blueprint, and then Anim Class should be the new Animation Blueprint you made. You'll also start to see if you've brought the entry node into an animation state that has an animation, he should start playing that animation by default in this little window. You can see he's playing his idle. Okay, so this is returning what's owning our animation blueprint instance, which is the default enemy BP because we just set that up. But it doesn't know what type it is, so we have to cast it. So go ahead and drag off the return value of this. Type cast to, and then you want to cast to your default enemy blueprint edition, since this is the one that has the mesh and all that stuff. Okay, cast the default enemy BP, and then drag off of that and set character reference. So character reference is a variable we can either make in the animation blueprint, or we can drag off and promote it to a variable. This character reference is going to be used in the animation blueprint to check variables that we have in our code class. So any variables we have in here, such as has taken damage, is dead, or health, we can go ahead and drag off of this character reference to get. So there's two ways to make a character reference. You can either make a new variable, click on the pill, which is the type, and type in the type that you're trying to make. We're trying to make a default enemy BP, this guy right here. So if you click this and hit object reference, well, you're good to go. You can rename this to character reference and be good. The easier way, but not always the most, not always the easiest way to remember, but the easier way in terms of steps is to drag off of something that is that type. So as default enemy BP, you can see the type is default enemy BP object reference, which is what we want. You can drag off of this and hit promote to variable right here under the search bar, and then it will make one for you, and then you could rename this. Either way, just go ahead and make one of these, call it character reference. Now that we have this, we have access to all of the variables that our code class has. So we will be able to use these in our animation blueprint, in our state machine. So, idle to take damage. We want our has taken damage. The variable we set up here has taken damage. But if you were to just look for has taken damage, nothing would come up. And then if you look for it without context sensitive, it would come up, but you wouldn't technically be able to use it correctly. Like if you did this, then you'll get an error because the enemy BP is not equal to a default enemy BP. That's why we set up the reference. So once you have the reference, you can drag the reference onto the screen. And if you want to go from idle to take damage, you get your character reference and look for has taken damage, as I've done above. And now you'll see it works when I drag it in. Okay, so I know it's already above. I just wanted to drag that point out so you guys understand exactly what's going on. Now we're going to do this for all of our states. So idle to taken damage, that's great. And then idle to dead is the same. I'm going to drag off and check for the is dead boolean we set in code. And then idle to walking will be actually slightly different, but again, we're not covering that today, so don't worry about that. I have it so dead can't go back to idle right now. However, technically they can respawn, or like there's enemies that they just go into like an inactive state and then will come back later, like skeletons in Dark Souls. So don't worry if you want to make this dead to idle, that's fine. The states don't really matter. They just make sure they do what you need them to do. Okay, so take damage back to idle. So take damage to idle, idle to take damage, all good. We just make sure it has taken damage occurs. However, when we want to return to idle from an animation, that's no problem. We can do it a simpler way than checking if has taken damage has been reset or whatever garbage. There's something here. If you click on the transition rule coming back from the state we just entered. So we entered take damage once we took damage. We want to return from take damage to idle once that animation has finished playing. So we don't have to set up any logic in here. There's something by default you can do in Unreal. If you click on the transition rule and look over here under details transition, I'll expand this out for you. Something called automatic rule based on sequence player in state boolean. This right here means essentially, it means a lot of things, but essentially it means if there's not a better state to go to, then I'm going to go ahead and use this transition rule once this animation has stopped playing, once it has finished. So if you go ahead and check that, when you are done taking damage, you should now return to idle. Make sure that your animations are not looping. So if you click on an animation in the state and go over to detail settings, loop animation, and disable that, sometimes that will get you caught in a loop even with this boolean on. So if you see that you take damage and he keeps playing the take damage animation over and over again, turn that off. That's probably the... Or don't turn this off. Turn off the looping in the animation itself. That's probably the issue. There's one last thing we need to do, because regardless if we have loop on or not, if our condition from idle to take damage is met, has taken damage, then it's going to go to the take damage animation. Well, we've never set it back to false after we've taken damage. We've just said return back to idle once this animation is finished. We never set the boolean back. There's something we can do here in the details panel under notifications. Start transition event means as soon as this transition is going to occur, so take damage is going to return to idle, we can call an event in the event graph. You just type in a name here, and it will automatically create one for you. So I called mine return to idle. If you go into your event graph now, you can look for this name that you typed in, and you'll get functionality. So you can type return to idle, and here's your anim notify for it. Or whoops, that is technically correct, but since I've already made it, you'll need this one, event anim notify return to idle. You see I've already made it, so it brings me there. Okay, so once you've got this event here, then you can perform logic. So when this animation is finished and we're going to go from take damage to idle, we want to reset our take damage boolean. And remember, we can only get that from the character reference. So drag your character reference on or search for it. Drag off your character reference, type set has taken damage right here, and make sure you set it back to false. Leave this unchecked. Once all that is done, you will now be able to go into your game, go up to an enemy. You can see they're playing idle by default. Go ahead and shoot them. You can see if they're in a damaged state when they lose all their health. So let me weaken them up. So if they're not in damaged state, they just die without playing the take damage animation, which is great. If they're in a damaged state, then you'll see they'll die after their damage animation is finished. We can change it so they can die in the middle of their take damage animation, but I just wanted to show you that if you get them down to their last bit of life, you can kill them without them going into the take damage function, which is just a lot cleaner, in my opinion. But now you should have all that working. The last thing is, I wanted to go over kind of positioning these enemies correctly in the scene. So first of all, you can flat out just bring these into the scene. So if you go to your enemy, you can just drag it in, just like this. Now, in your default enemy BP, you might have to reposition him. He might be facing a different way from the health bar and all that. So make sure he looks like this. Make sure you can see the health bar and him. But you can drag him in, real simple. Rotate them however you want. Good to go. Okay, so what you'll actually want to do for positioning him, you can see these guys are kind of floating above the ground. You can make this happen however you want. But the Capsule Collider here, so you see this like invisible Capsule Collider here. This Capsule Collider is called a Capsule Component. You can verify this by going into your default enemy BP, clicking on Capsule Component. You can see it here. This is kind of what's going to determine this and character movement are what's going to determine exactly how he falls on the ground. So you want his feet pretty much in line with the capsule component, and then you also want to make sure that his gravity is enabled. It will be by default, so I'm not gonna really go over it, but I think it's if you go into character movement and type in gravity scale, make sure it's 1, apply gravity while jumping. That should be good enough. I mean, we're gonna do stuff with gravity in the future, so I'm not going to bother messing with it today. But you can see I've placed him where the Capsule Collider is colliding with the ground, not necessarily just his feet, although I've tried to get his feet and Capsule Collider at about the same distance. And you can see he sits on the ground rather nicely. They all kind of do. So there you go, guys. You can drag as many of these guys as you want into the scene. Go ahead and shoot them. They'll die. You can ricochet them if you're really fancy. You might be able to ricochet off of each other. There you go. That's how the pros do it, is bounce off of one another. You can see this guy took some damage. And we'll do some more stuff for like headshots doing more damage, and they have different hit reactions based on where you hit them. We'll clean them up and get rid of their health bars and things like that once they die. There's plenty we can do with this, but I think this is a pretty good intro, or this is technically the second part of enemies, but now we have a little bit of a more intelligent enemy, even though he's not really doing anything. He can just switch between animations and dies and such. But Alright guys, that's all I got for today. So if this video helped you, please subscribe. It helps me more than anything else you can do for the channel, and it just lets me know that I'm doing a good job and helping you learn something, so I'd really appreciate it. If you did have any issues or any questions, you can go ahead and join the Discord, and I'll be happy to help you out. I can't post the Discord link in the iCard because Discord doesn't, or YouTube doesn't like that, but you can go ahead and look in the description. It'll be right next to Discord as a link. Lastly, guys, if you want to come support me on Twitch, twitch.tv/Shawnthebro27. We play Dark Souls games on Wednesday, Resident Evil games on Friday. Always have fun. Just amazing game, and a ton of you have come over from there and supported me, so I just want to say thank you so much for the wonderful support I've gotten from you guys. I really, really do appreciate it. There's an iCard here if you want to check out the Twitch channel on YouTube, which is just my Twitch streams archives channel. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, my friends.